I think that would be of interest to people. And anything you want to talk about after that regarding your veterans stuff?
What do you want, you want to talk about World War II and
Yeah, that'd be
what
great.
you did in it, or
Yeah, do
talk
that.
about your
Sure.
background educationally and what we did with our lives?
Exactly. Your first name is Edward?
My name is Edward Leo Glockner, and they call me Ebby, E-B-B-Y. And that name Abby came from my dad's youngest sister who couldn't say Edward, and
So she
call me
squished
Abby,
it together to
right?
Abby.
And I've been called that ever since. I guess I've been called some worse things than that.
You will be on tape. In fact, you are the first person on tape 13. Keep that with your stuff. 100 years from now, somebody will find this and they'll say, oh my goodness, we can go down to the Portsmouth Public Library and see Uncle Ebby.
That's good. I've got, I have about 18 scrapbooks.
Do you?
With
Oh, great.
genealogy background.
Oh, do you? Well, this would be something to add to it. Let me put you on my roster. When were you born?
March the 6th, 1921, here in Portsmouth. I was born upstairs in a little building on the corner of 2nd and Chillicothe Street,
2nd Chillicothe.
which eventually became the showroom of the Glockner Chevrolet Company.
Oh, really? That goes back ways. Okay, now, Abby, you told me your name and your date of birth, and you were born in Portsmouth, Ohio. What is your present address?
2920 Willow Way.
Okay, in Portsmouth. And your occupation?
Well, I'm would be
Retired?
considered retired, but I'd say
Okay.
semi-retired.
Okay, well, explain that a little further.
Well,
Probably more work to do now than ever.
I guess I'd have to get into our genealogy.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
You do that? Do you
My
trace
great-
the?
My great-grandfather came over with his older brother from Germany, from a little town of Bingen, in the Duchy of Baden, which is about 16 miles south of Freiburg, and in 1847.
Okay.
And they settled here in Portsmouth. And my grandfather, his name was Bernard, our great-grandfather's name was Bernard, and he went to work for a hardware merchant down on Market Street by the name of John Rottinghouse, who was also German. Of course, those boys came over from Germany and couldn't speak English, and in fact, I have their the ship they came over on and what it cost them, which was $25. It took them 6 weeks to get over here. But anyway, he learned English, and in 1840, the latter part of 1848, he bought John Rottinghouse hardware store. And so he was in business, and it was interesting. He came over on the boat with a older couple and their daughter from the same town by the name of Beck. And after about 4 years, he went to Cincinnati and asked for this Anna Beck's hand in marriage from Mr. Beck, and Mr. Beck said that she was already betrothed to a fellow by the name of Zimmer. But he said, I have another daughter that's on her way over, and her name is Magdalena, and he said she isn't spoken for. So great-grandfather came back to Portsmouth and went back down in 4 months and met her, and they were married here in Portsmouth. And they had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. And he, of course, made his livelihood out of the hardware business, and which wasn't much back in those days. I mean, they sold wire and barbed wire and
That's in Portsmouth that they
Yeah,
got the
this
business.
is Portsmouth.
Where would that have been located? Market
On
Street?
Market Street.
Say, okay.
And in fact, a picture of it is on the murals
Oh,
on one of
okay.
those portraits of Market Street back in the 1850s. And so anyway, great-grandfather died in 1876 and left a German-speaking widow with the 7 children. The older boys helped her run that hardware store, and she owned it, and she died in 1891, and my grandfather bought the other children's interest in the inheritance of the hardware store, and took his youngest brother, who was 15 years old at the time, whose name was Adolf Glockner, in as a full partner. And they took on bicycles and buggies, and he was very aggressive. And in 1806, a fellow by the name of Bill Durant, who eventually founded General Motors Corporation,
That'd be
called
1906.
on him to sell him buggies.
Oh,
Bill Durant was from Flint, Michigan, and he contracted to buy the total production of a buggy manufacturer up there, which was 1,800 buggies a year. And so Bill went out to find people who would contract to buy buggies, and you had to give him $50 earnest money to fulfill the purchase agreement. And grandfather agreed to buy 100 buggies, and he did that up into 1910, at which time Bill Durant had started General Motors Corporation, and they had bought the Oldsmobile and Buick manufacturing plants and AC Delco over in Dayton for the electric starters. And the lenders and the big money interest from over east didn't like Durant's lack of profitability in running the business. He could put it together, but he wasn't a profitable operator. So they forced Bill out, and Bill went and got 2 brothers by the name of Chevrolet. One of them's name was Louis Chevrolet, and he was the fastest race car driver at that time, and his approach was he would build a small car that would compete with Henry Ford, and that he would outsell Ford. And of course Ford built all black automobiles. But anyway, they built an 8-cylinder and a 4-cylinder car, and in 1910 they had their prototype out. And Bill went back to find dealers or people who would buy cars from him to resell, and of course he went back to the people he had sold buggies to, who were his customers, had been his customers, and my grandfather signed up with him. And as of today, which is the 10th of July, the year 2000, we are the oldest continuing Chevrolet dealer in the United States of the 7,000 Chevrolet dealers.
yeah, in the United States, not just Ohio.
No, just yet in the United
Interesting.
States.
And you'd point that toward, not, what, 1911 or what?
1911, first cars were sold in 1912.
1912.
So my grandfather had a double hernia and went to the Mayo Clinic in 1926 and to have that surgery done, was getting along fine, and died of a blood clot, which which he left my father and three daughters and his widow and his brother. And of course they had separated the automobile business from the hardware business. They moved from Market Street to Gay Street on Gallia and Gay in 1912. 1913 flood got them, and they moved down on the corner of 2nd and Chillicothe Street, which is now the intersection of 3rd Street Boulevard that runs in
Mhm.
front of Shawnee State University.
Let me close the other door. I think I'm probably bleeding into that. There's some conversation in the other room there. I want to keep that from happening. Hi.
Yes, yes, geez, how's your busy too?
Okay, thank you very much. All right, 2 doors there, and then we'll keep it off the interference. Well, then after, let's see, when did you officially then?
Well, then my dad and his sister, Aunt Helen, who never married, took over the operation of the hardware and the dealership. And of course, that was in 1926. And of course, the crash of the Depression hit in 29, and the banks called their notes, and they were forced to liquidate the hardware store. And which they had $1 million inventory at that time, which was a lot of inventory for the value of the dollar at that time was had a greater purchasing power than
That they kept the dealership.
They kept the dealership, but they lost the building. But the lenders let them come back in and buy it out of the. They did not take a bankruptcy. And they paid everybody out. By 1948, they had paid everybody out. But of course, they went through the 1913 flood and the 37 flood and the depressions and the war with having no cars to sell. And
You were around then. You were born in 21.
well, I
you said?
I graduated from high school in 1940 and went to college on a football scholarship up at St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer, Indiana. And my dad said in the spring, in May of 41, when we came home from school, I had a brother that was 20 months younger than myself, and I failed in the 3rd grade, and he caught up with me. We went all the way through school in our freshman year of college, and so we went to work down at Wright Aeronautical in Cincinnati building radial engines.
Was that after you'd gone to college, or?
Well, I had 1 year of college in.
You had a year of college and you went to work at Wright-Patterson?
Wright Aeronautical.
They call it Wright Aeronautical.
In Cincinnati.
Oh, in Cincinnati. Okay.
Well, then, of course, this was in June of 41, and of course, December of the 7th of 41 was brought us into the war. And I went to enlist in January of 42.
Okay.
And to get in the Air Force, Army, or the Navy, you had to have 2 years of college.
Okay.
So I went back to college that fall, or winter, and I took civilian pilot training.
Okay.
And
Did that give you credit then, the 2 years credit that you needed to get in?
Gave me, yeah, I was able to take enough courses, plus I had my private pilot's license.
You had a pilot's license at that time?
Yeah, in June of 1942, I enlisted in the Naval Air Corps. But at the time I did, you no longer had to have 2 years of college. So I was not called up into the Navy flight training program until September of 42. And of course we went to pre-flight and then into primary flying. And I was commissioned, and we had a choice, not a definite choice, but we could express our preference whether we wanted to be a fighter pilot, a dive bomber pilot, or a torpedo pilot, torpedo plane pilot. And I chose to be a torpedo plane pilot, and of course to fly off of carriers. And so I was commissioned in July of 43, and went to advance, went out to the West Coast to join a squadron in November. Weather was bad. Had a shortage of aircraft to force to even fly or train. And in late December, they assigned me to with no training as far as dropping torpedoes or firing any 50 caliber guns. The aircraft we had didn't have the advanced technology at the planes that they were flying in combat. So anyway, I was shipped out to, first I reported to San Diego. They gave me responsibility with 19 other pilots to fly in a DC-3 to New York and fly 20 torpedo planes back from Floyd Bennett Field in New Jersey and back to San Diego. Took us 3 days because of bad weather, and landed out there in the evening about 5:30 and went in to report to the officer of the day, and they gave me orders to board a carrier that night. So I shipped out at 8:30 that night and ended up going out as a replacement pilot in the fleet. And when we did two things. We replaced planes because many of the pilots who were shot down would make water landings and were picked up by our own ships or submarines. And of course the pilots were brought back to the ships that and the squadrons that they flew off of, the carriers they flew off of. So in March of 1944, I was put into Torpedo Squadron 8, and we flew off of the Bunker Hill, which was an Essex class carrier. And those squadrons carried a complement of 24 torpedo planes and 24 dive bombers and 40 fighters. Now, they never put all those planes in the air at one time. They always kept at least half of the squadron on the ship. One deck load of planes would take off and would go to whatever assignment we had, which was at that time first action was Truck Island, which was a big naval base in a volcanic island way west of Honolulu, and we caught them by surprise and sank many ships. And both ships of the train, which would be their merchant fleet, which would provide provisions for their army that were on the islands. And we went, next engagement was Hollandia, down in below the Marshall Islands, and then we covered the landing of and the invasion of Guam and Saipan and Tinian in May and June of 44. And then the Japs attacked the task force. Task force that we're in had 16 carriers and 8 battleships and 12 cruisers and 126 destroyers. And it was just a mass of ships and firepower. And the battleships and the carriers would do over 18 knots. And but we had no intelligence. We weren't prepared to ever fight the Japanese, and our government and its intelligence forces had no intelligence on the Japanese and on these islands, so we had no maps or topography maps. And at that time, of course, they were advancing the technology and capability of the aircraft we flew. When we first started, we only had 30 caliber machine guns that we could fire forward, and we ended up with 6 50 calibers, and then excuse me, and then we ended up with rockets, with rocket launchers under the wings.
Mhm. Was this on a torpedo plane?
This was on a torpedo plane.
Mhm. What was the name of the plane, the type of plane?
They called it a TBM-F or TBM, torpedo bomber, and F meant that it was manufactured by Grumman,
Mhm.
and M that was manufactured by General Motors.
Mhm. Okay. Did it have a nickname of anything? That wasn't a Avenger, was it?
That was the Avenger.
It was an Avenger, okay. Okay, that had a rear gunner, did it not?
Had a radioman and a gunner, but really they were obsolete from how they thought we would use them. But it did give us, the gunner had a revolving turret with 150 caliber gun that could fire at a fighter that would make a run on us.
Okay.
There were a lot of planes lost in the actions, but not as many pilots as
Must have been a tough plane. Was it difficult to
all
hold
the
together?
The planes were well built, and of course, this Avenger was the largest stick-flown aircraft that had ever been built. It weighed 16,000 pounds and carried a bomb load of 2,000 pounds.
Did you ever meet George Bush?
No,
That's what he
George
flew, wasn't
was out there after I was out there.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, let me ask you this now. You're married. What's your wife's name?
I married Joanne Crick,
Okay.
and she was from over in Nauvoo, 2nd Street in West Portsmouth.
And her maiden name was Crick.
Crick.
What were her parents' names?
Herman Crick, and her mother was a,
If you think of it later.
was a Morrison.
Morrison was her maiden name. Okay. All right. And you have children?
We have 3 children. I have a daughter, Susan, who married Steve Fitzer, who is a dentist, and they have 2 sons.
What are their names?
Gregory, who is 22.
Uh-huh.
I guess, well, he'll be 23 at Christmas time. And a son that's 12 years old, Brett. And my only son, Andy, who is 48 years of age, has 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls.
Okay.
His oldest son, Timmy, just turned 24, and he's a graduate of Xavier University. And
What was his major?
business, and always wanted to come into the car automobile business, and he now manages the Honda and Toyota dealerships.
Okay.
And is a hard worker and just a real fine young man.
That's your grandson?
That's my oldest grandson.
Okay. And Andy manages what?
Well, Andy owns all these stores.
All the stores?
Yeah, I don't own any of the businesses anymore. And
Now, he had 5 children.
he has 5.
What are their names?
And the oldest one is Timmy, we were talking about. And Joe is a senior up at Capital University. He wants to come back, wants to be in business. And he has a daughter, Elizabeth Beth, who will be a sophomore at University of Kentucky next year. And he has a 4th child who is Michael. Mike just turned 18 a week ago, and it will be a senior at Notre Dame High School, and is one of the more notarized young golfers in the area. But a good athlete, and he's on the honor roll at Notre Dame. He's a good student. Wants to go to Xavier University and would like to play golf and take a business course. And the youngest daughter is Chrissy, and Chrissy just turned 10.
Oh, okay, 10.
So then my youngest daughter, Mary Ann, is a physical therapist, and she graduated from Indiana University Medical School, and she married an orthodontist by the name of Tom Burns, and they live in Lafayette, Indiana.
I see.
And his father had been a dentist, and they have 3 children. They have a daughter, Allison, and their second daughter is Sally, and they have a 9-year-old son, Gregory.
Okay. Now, you enlisted, you say, in the Naval Air Corps. And when was the date of your enlistment?
I enlisted the 2nd of June, 1942.
42, yes. And when is your discharge date?
I was discharged the 1st of January of 45.
What was your rank when you were discharged?
I was a full lieutenant.
That would be Army captain, I think, right?
Right,
Is
yeah.
that correct? Where did you do your basic training then? Would that be in?
Well, I had a choice of going to primary or going to pre-flight or going on into primary, and I was advised to go to pre-flight, but it ended up being a Marine boot camp, so it wasn't. But anyway, I think maybe I owe my life to having done it. But I went to Kansas City in primary at Latha, Kansas, and the rest of my training until I was commissioned was at Corpus Christi, Texas, at different base outlying fields.
Okay.
And then after being commissioned, I was assigned to Jacksonville, Florida for operational, and my instructor there was a fellow by the name of Ensign Gay, G-A-Y, who was the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8 in the Battle of Midway.
Oh.
And he's since passed away. He stayed in the Navy and was a captain, and but was an ensign at that time.
Did he get shot down and was in the water?
He was shot down and was in the water for about 3 days.
You saw the fighting going on over that, all that business? I read about that.
Well, see, that we were so inept and so unprepared for the war that none of those torpedo pilots had ever dropped a torpedo.
The first time you dropped a torpedo, was that in practice or was that in combat?
That was the first time I was in combat.
Actually in
First
combat.
time I shot a rocket was on a combat run.
It was on-the-job training.
Right.
Now, were you on the Bunker Hill the whole time, or were you on other ships?
Well, before I went on the Bunker Hill, I was on 3 other ships.
Okay, what were they?
Like I told you, I went out as a replacement
Right.
pilot and we would fly planes to these ships and land them. They would put us off in what they call a boatswain's chair on a pulley off to a destroyer. The destroyer would take us back to the carrier that we flew the planes on.
So you'd get on a little pulley chair between ships, and there you'd be dangling on a cable
Right.
over the ocean.
Right.
Hopefully it wouldn't break and you'd go over to the destroyer.
Yeah, or they didn't come together and they got caught
Right.
between them.
Oh, gosh.
But it was no sweat. It's
Well, what was that like trying to land on a aircraft carrier?
well, I think we were trained to do that. The the Army, we always laughed at the Army because they flew their planes into land, and we were trained to fly at about 5 knots over stalling speed. So we were taught to fly with our wheels and flaps down, and if this were the carrier and the carrier's going in this direction, we would, when we came back from a hop, the carriers and all the ships in the fleet would have to go into the wind. And of course, the more wind was coming over the deck, and of course the ships moving at 18 knots gave us a slower speed when we really hit the deck. Well, anyway, we would fly parallel to the ship and peel off and come back, and we would come down a pattern like this. When the ship got about 45 degrees from us, we would start a turn and we would line up to come in. There would be a guy on this corner of the flight deck called a landing signal officer.
So you had the flags?
He had 2 wands, and he would tell you if you were too high or too low, or if you were too slow. He would give you this to tell you to speed up, and you did what he told you to do. You know, if you didn't, chances are you were going to be in trouble. So when you got in a position that he felt he would give you a signal like this, you would cut your throttle and you would mush your plane down so that the tail hook that was on the end of the plane would pick up one of the cables across here. Because halfway up the deck were crash barriers, and the planes that had landed ahead of you would have taxied forward and would be up here forward on the flight deck.
How many cables did you have to try and get?
I think there was 14 cables.
14? Okay.
But you tried to pick up the first one, and not more than the third one.
Okay.
So when you landed, the deckhands on the ship, what they called flyboys, they told you to raise your flaps and then to fold and to open your or to fold your wings. The wings on his plane's folded hydraulically, and then they would lower those crash barriers, and they would land the plane every 20 seconds. So you had to be moving because there was going to be another guy come in. If you weren't forward of that crash barrier, by the time this guy was in a position to land, that landing signal officer would give him a wave off. So he would have to go this way and fly back out and come back around.
You took off in the wind too, didn't you?
Right.
Did you take, and you landed in the wind too.
Right.
Okay.
And we, they catapulted us off the ship. It was like being shot with a slingshot.
Did they have catapults on at that time?
Oh yeah. Probably a third of my takeoffs were catapulted, were just shot off. And
would you still rev up as fast as you can?
Oh yeah, you'd have your, and the big thing is you're going from a dead stop to 120 knots, well 90 knots, which is about 110 miles an hour, in a 150-foot length, so you have a lot of pressure. So we had a headrest that came out, and we would put our head against it to keep it from snapping. You had to keep your hand on the throttle and the propeller pitch control to keep it from coming back, because if you lost power, you're going to settle into the water. And of course, like you say, you're taking off with full flaps. So when they shot you and you take off, and you would clear the deck to the right, so the prop wash wouldn't come on down on the deck, and you'd go out and climb up and pull your wheels up as soon as you could, because if you had an engine failure and went in the water, the wheels being down would be more likely to flip you upside down.
Mhm.
And so anyway, but I was the only guy in our squadron that didn't have a water landing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You never had to go into the
And
drain?
we had 3 sets of planes. We lost we lost 3 complete, in other words, we lost 72 aircraft
Is that
in
right?
10 months that we were out there.
How many missions did you go on?
I had 68 missions.
Is that what we would call sorties?
Well,
What do
you
you call
could, you could. We just called them, we really never counted them because we also did anti-sub work,
Oh, I see.
flights, and which were a 4-hour flight.
Now, that was basically to observe or reconnoiter?
Well, we had, our radar didn't have the distance to, radar can only pick up on a straight line, and there could be Jap subs following the fleet.
Mhm.
And of course, they would more likely be they would be on top of the water at dusk and night and at dawn.
Did you do night flights?
Not combat flights, no, but we did pre-dawn flights,
Mhm.
which we took off in the dark, but we had no way to come aboard at night at that time.
Mhm.
And the ships were all blacked out, so the Japanese couldn't pick us up or their subs.
You had, those planes had 3 men in them, or 2?
Mhm.
3. Okay. There were 2 forward-looking and then the rear gunner, rear-looking.
No, the pilot sat as if he were just like a fighter pilot. He was totally on his own. Those 2 men did nothing that would help you fly the aircraft. You did the radio work. The only way you would use your radio man was that if you got a enemy contact, they could use wireless, the Morse code, to communicate back to the ships.
Well, where did he sit? Where did the radio operator sit?
He sat behind the bomb bay, down on the bottom rear of the aircraft.
He was inside.
Right.
He didn't have a canopy or anything. Okay. Whenever I've seen pictures, I've seen 2 guys in that particular plane.
Right,
That's because
yeah,
the third
that's
one-
right.
Okay.
Well, they used to, between the turret gunner and the pilot, they used to have an observer compartment, and they did away with that.
Mhm.
Oh, they had some planes that would accommodate them, but most of our work was looking for, our primary target was aircraft on the ground,
Mhm.
and
As a torpedo plane?
we did more what we called glide bombing. Torpedoes were, we never dropped a torpedo unless you were engaged with the shipping,
Mhm.
and we didn't end up with the opportunity to do that but twice.
Mhm.
So most of the guys, 1 to 2 torpedoes would be all they dropped. Well, our torpedoes were not the best of quality.
I've read this, sometimes bounced off.
They would porpoise,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they would lose their direction. Of course, they had a little gyro in them. Their depth, they would maybe run too deep,
Mhm.
or they wouldn't run at all.
Mm.
So you were putting your life in jeopardy,
Mhm.
and
You dropped torpedoes? Did you do that twice, you said?
Yeah.
Did you get any hits?
I didn't, because of the torpedoes didn't run true.
How many torpedoes would a plane?
One
torpedo is what I thought.
torpedo weighed about 2,000 pounds.
And if you weren't carrying torpedoes, could you fit it with bombs?
We could carry 1 2,000-pound bomb, or 2 1,000s, or 4 500s,
4 5s?
or we could carry 12 we could carry 400 or 500 pound depth charges.
Oh,
So if we were looking for subs, we could drop depth charges.
mhm.
But most of our work, and we also dropped incendiary bombs, which would lay out a pattern of, which we did to destroy hangars and even aircraft.
Now, you were a truck in Hollandia, and where else did you go?
Well, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, we were on the first strikes on Iwo Jima,
Were you?
Chichijima, and Ha Jima.
When you say first strikes at Iwo Jima, this would not be the landing, this would be...
Oh, we were a year ahead of the landing. Formosa, first strikes on Formosa. First strikes on the Philippines, the first,
Did you go to Japan?
well,
I mean, did you bomb Japan, or?
oh no, there was no, the B-29s were the first to bomb Japan, but we were about 800 miles off the coast of Japan on an occasion that, hoping we would surprise some of their shipping. Weather was terrible. It was Aleutian weather. It was down. It was almost instrument weather, and of course we were restricted. But I was flying toward a anti-sub patrol on that particular, because we didn't do any bombing. We were looking for shipping.
Well, when the war ended, did you then go into Japan, or did you?
Well,
what
I
did you
came
do?
back in December of '44, and I was put in the hospital for 3 months. I was to reorganize Torpedo Squadron 8, and anyway, the 3 months I was in the hospital, or till I was released, they had changed the complement of the type of aircraft, and they reduced the number of torpedo planes on those big carriers from 24 to 12. And but when I came out of the hospital, I ended up being the executive officer in what we called a composite squadron, which was, they call them VC squadrons. And these VC squadrons flew off of what we called Kaiser coffins, Kaiser-built ships. The flight deck on the Essex class carrier was about 875 feet long. The Kaiser aircraft, their carrier decks were less than 600 feet. And they carried 20 fighters and 12 torpedo bombers. That's all they carried. And I formed with a squadron that had been out on the landing at Lady, which was a composite squadron 81, and when the fellows came back to the States in March of '45, because they were out there in October. The landing at Lady was in October 26th of 1944. They reorganized these squadrons. They usually took half of the experienced pilots and put them in with new squadrons, and kept half of the experienced pilots to train half inexperienced that had never been in combat. And I ended up in a VC-81 in March of '45, and we were going to go out as a night hunter-killer group, which was a new approach. We would have been flying at night off of those small carriers. And so it was complete different approach, and we were scheduled to ship out just 10 days before the war ended.
What kind of plane would you have flown then? The same? Okay.
Same plane.
So would you have had to land at night then?
Yeah.
You would have. Okay. Now, after, when the war, where were you when they dropped the bomb, August 6th?
I was down in what they call Holtville, California, down the Imperial Valley.
Uh-huh.
Down Hope.
Hopeville, okay.
It was down near Calexico and Yuma.
What were you doing?
We were doing night.
Night training, I think?
Training. We did all night flying.
And when you first heard about the bomb, did you understand what it meant, or what? First heard about the atomic bomb?
Well, of course, we were elated the fact that the Japanese
Got it.
that they had it, and of course, that it was almost instantaneous that they announced that they'd surrendered. So, of course, we didn't know whether we were gonna go on out or what, but they were real quick in unwinding the squadrons.
When, let's say, you told me when you were discharged, when was that? December?
January of '46.
January. That would be pretty soon.
I ended up at Grosse Ile Naval Air Base in Detroit, and had the responsibility for inventory in the whole base, which is a sizable job, and accounting for all the sidearms and all the material and everything. And I was discharged in January. Well, I got home Christmas Eve. My date of discharge was 5th of January.
Did you get married after the service, or were you married?
No, I came back, and I was really going to make a career of the Navy. I liked it, and it was the best paying job that I'd ever had.
Was it exciting?
Having grown up in the Depression.
Oh, yeah.
My dad had lost his home. Being in business and surviving a family business for 6 generations, everybody assumes that you've been rich and are always rich, but that isn't true. And of course, it has been with the prosperity we've had since post-war in the last 50 years. And with the peaks and valleys of the economy being more level.
You got married while you were in the service then?
No, I didn't. Now, I can never see, half the guys got married, and I can never see it. And 1 out of 4 guys was killed flying. And so I didn't get married until 1950.
Okay.
And January of '50. And but I went back to school down at Xavier University and took a business course. And after I'd worked at the family business for 2 months, I saw how much family was in it. There was just too many people trying to live out of it. And so that's what I did. And then when I graduated, in January of '48, there just weren't any jobs. And at that particular time, when I was looking for a job, and I'd only been out of school 2 weeks, my aunt, with my father's sister, who really was the business manager of the business, had an internal hemorrhage and was required to quit working. And she asked me if I wouldn't come back and come into business, and that's what I did.
Okay.
And so in the early 50s, I think 52, in order to be the car dealer, you have to own at least 25% of the stock. And so my dad and his sister gave me and sold me a combination of the two, the equivalent of 25% of the stock. And I forfeited any right to any participation in their estates. And Chevrolet recognized me as the dealer.
Mhm.
So anyway, in the 50s, 1959, there was so much, my dad brought two of my brothers into the business. They each had 12 children, by the way. They each had
Gosh.
six boys and 6 girls.
Each of them had
Each of
6
them.
and 6?
And my youngest brother had 3 boys and 4 girls. My sister had 5 boys and 5 girls. So there were 44 offspring of the 5 marriages.
Gosh.
My brother Lee, I've lost him now. Back in 1942, in 42, he enlisted in the Naval Air Corps,
Mhm.
along with another cousin. And the cousin ended up being an instructor at Corpus Christi. My brother Lee was 2 months behind me. He had finished his flight training down in Pensacola, Florida. The instructor took them to New Orleans in a flight of 6 planes, what we called an SNJ. It was an advanced trainer. It was a 600 horsepower, single engine, monoplane, to New Orleans for a long weekend, and put them in a right echelon. And not intentionally, but there was a flight of pelicans, and the pelican hit the leading edge of my brother's plane. It knocked a pitot tube off, which tells you what your airspeed is. And he radioed the instructor who was leading the flight, and he was told to go up to altitude and check his stalling characteristics with his wheels down and the flaps down, and because he wasn't going to be able to tell what his speed was other than by feel. And they shut the field down and let him come in on emergency approach, and he was about 500 feet in the air and about 500 feet from the end of the runway, and got too slow. Of course, the wing dropped and the plane went nosed in and burned up, and he was killed.
Okay, well, how many brothers and sisters did you have?
I was the oldest of 5 boys and a girl, my sister.
Okay. You and your brother Lee were in the Second War then?
Right.
Okay. Do your other brothers go to Korea or anything like
My
that?
brother Dave was drafted, or I guess he was drafted. I never had talked to him about it. In 1946.
Drafted in 46?
Yeah. He graduated from high school in 43.
Okay. So you were single when you were a naval aviator, right?
Right.
Okay. What does a single naval aviator do on Liberty?
Well, look for girls.
Did you go to Pearl Harbor in it? Were you?
Well, we never got any leave out there. I did. I had an aunt and uncle who were civilians that were running my aunt was running a carburetor overhaul unit at Pearl Harbor. And my uncle was a materiel officer, or person. So I had them when I was back into Pearl Harbor, which was only twice. And, I guess 3 times. The third time was coming back to the States, and which was nice. But no, we had lived in bachelor officer quarters, which were first class in most cases. They weren't down in the islands. If you were flying off the islands, we were put off of a ship in early November onto an island that had been captured by the Marines and secured, and the Seabees had built a landing strip on it, and we were put there to wait for transportation back to the States. Well, the squadron replaced us, one aboard, and that was in early November of 44.
What was the best thing that ever happened to you in the service?
Well, I think the best thing that ever happened to me was being a naval aviator, for one thing, and number two was it's terrible to say because I've always felt bad for the foot soldier because we slept on clean sheets at night and we didn't have air conditioning then on those ships, but we had blowers, air blowers that kept the air moving over you. But and you always had hot and cold running water, and you had clean clothes. Whether they had a laundry aboard the ship on those ships or that carrier I was on had 1,900 personnel, and their whole purpose of being there was for we pilots to.
How many pilots were on the ship?
There was 40, I think it was 48 of us.
Well, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you?
I don't think I've ever had anything bad happen to me.
Do you keep in touch with any of your friends?
Yeah, I do. In fact, we're gonna have a reunion with one group. I chairmaned a reunion a year ago, will be here in September, of the group that I was an executive officer in after I'd come back from overseas. There's only a third of those guys alive today. Now our Torpedo Squadron 8 group, and we haven't covered that because the original Torpedo Squadron 8 was wiped out at Midway, and those that weren't at Midway lost their lives at Guadalcanal. They flew TBFs off the land down there and against the Japs and securing Guadalcanal. So we were the replacement Torpedo Squadron 8, and
When will that
so,
reunion?
well, we're gonna have a reunion the 9th of November down in Pensacola, Florida. But of the 28 of us who were in that squadron, which 8 of them were killed in combat, and their replacements, of the 28 of us, there's only 5 of us living, and only 4 will be there.
While all this was going on, were you ever afraid?
Well, I think.
Did you know fear?
I don't think that you're not afraid. I mean, you don't panic, but I can't look back and say I was, but I'm sure I was. I mean,
Can you look back and see any time that it was exciting?
It was always exciting, because you never knew what was going to happen. You made things happen. You looked out for the other guys you were flying with. I watched the other guys shot down and go in. I saw 2 of my buddies get shot down in front of me while I was on the same run they were, and they blew up in the air.
What run was that? What mission was that? Truck?
That was in Luzon and the Subic Bay area in the Philippines. I had 3 planes that I got back aboard ship with, that they just shoved them over the side that they were shot up so bad. So I always felt that, they always said there's no atheist in a foxhole, but I put all my, the fact that I'm alive today and experienced and lived through the experiences on God's divine providence that He provided me with my life until He takes it.
Were you wounded? Were you ever wounded in combat?
No.
You were in a hospital. Did you become ill?
No, I had a cyst on the base of my spine and cyst on this.
Sitting on
Except
that.
on that parachute, hard parachute, for 4 hours at a time, aggravated it into. I really didn't know I had it until I came back and they didn't let you go home until they gave you a physical.
Oh.
They picked it up on the physical.
What decorations do you have?
I got a Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 air medals for 17 planes destroyed on the ground and 7 ships. Now those were not combat ships. They were merchant ships and personnel ship carriers.
You sunk them, you can be attributed to, okay.
Yeah,
And how many planes on the ground?
17.
17.
Had a lot of experiences. We had a battleship in the fleet I was in Task Force 38 and 58, and Bull Halsey was the commanding officer of the task forces, and I think, like all human beings, that pride and the notoriety and sometimes gets in the way of common sense and good judgment. And I just felt that what we allowed to happen at the Lady Gulf invasion in the Philippines by Halsey taking that Task Force 38, and he wanted to be a hero and annihilate the Japanese fleet. And
He headed off north, didn't he?
And they suckered him with, and we were out looking for those ships, and we should have been down there protecting those light carriers. And the interesting thing about those boys that covered the Lady Fleet action, that those small carriers, they only allowed each of those carriers to have 1 torpedo per torpedo plane. So each of those ships had 12 torpedoes. Well, you don't get a hit on every shot, and you don't get a hit every time you drop a torpedo. And you know, when the Japs came down through San Bernardino Straits, and their firepower and their speed exceeded what was of that Task Force 7. And these boys that were flying off in those composite squadrons, they're, you know, that's your home. They were trying to defend and doing everything, and it had to be done with torpedo bombers and the fighters with glide bombing. And I have 4 friends that I should have been with that got Navy crosses for getting hits and credit for sinking the Japanese battleships. And but anyway.
Did you ever see the kamikaze? Did you see that?
Oh yeah, and I've seen them, and
Was the Bunker Hill hit?
it was in 45. Yeah,
You were gone by that time.
We were off the ship at that time, but we had a near miss that I was playing. I was in the ready room, and with my flight gear on, in condition ready to take off if and when they asked us to take off. And this near miss came through the side of the ship, and the shrapnel from it came up through the deck. It took the pocket off of my flying suit where I had my gloves.
Shrapnel
did, yeah. And I never felt it, didn't touch my skin. Went in we had seats like on a Greyhound bus, and it went in the back, but I didn't know it. And the guys up in the front of the ready room, they got sprayed and got little cuts on. But
did they get a Purple Heart? You didn't?
one of the guys just died in January, who we found, could never find him, and found him. He was he's a quadriplegic. over in Brooklyn, New York. He died in January. When we found him a year ago, I called him and he said, I'm entitled to a Purple Heart. And he said, and I said, well, you got shrapnel in you aboard ship. He said, yeah, but I didn't go to the sick bay. And of course, it didn't go on his records. And he said, would you write a letter to the chaplain here at the Veterans Hospital in Brooklyn? Which I did, and told him all.
Did he get it?
And because I had all that down, and he got it and died 3 weeks later. And they had a lot of publicity on him. And
Eddie, is there anything else you'd like to add? I think we've covered the waterfront pretty well, don't you?
well, I think the guys that didn't come back, there were several fellows from here who flew in the Naval Air Corps that were friends of mine. Gene Gary is laying out at Hillview, stroke ridden, and has been for 12 years. He didn't get into combat. He flew military transport service, Naval Air Transport Service up into the Aleutians, which were DC-7s. But Paul Teapot's from here. Paul was in Dive Bomber Group 6 at Midway. He had 3 tours of duty, and he was shot down by our own ship. The New Jersey was a big battleship, and we call it the Iowa class. There's the Iowa and the New Jersey, and I think there's a Wisconsin now. Well, anyway, those new battleships, they shot down 27 of our own planes. And I don't say this derogatorily, but it's what happens in the confusion of combat. At Truck in January of '44, Paul had made runs on and had expended his bombs, and they had radio silence, and he came back to the fleet and was making a message drop on the New Jersey. And before we, on even days, before we approached our own ships, we had to make a slow turn to the right. On odd days, we made the turn to the left before he approached the ship. Made his right turn, approached the ship. We carried a little sandbag that we could put a message in. We could drop it on the deck of the ship. We'd put our wheels and flaps down just above stalling speed to go as slow as you could and drop that on the ship. He was doing that, and the gunnery control person, the boys that were on the fort, they were general quarters because they were in a combat condition. One of the 20 millimeter mount boys shot him down. So he was killed by our own people. And
He was from here, you say?
yeah, and he has a sister, but I tell you who you can talk to who's got he's really got a little mini museum in his home. That's Jim Cricker.
Jim Cricker?
Jim is a
Of the
cousin.
bank?
Yeah, Jim is a cousin to Paul Teapot.
Was Jim in the service too?
Yeah, but of course Jim is younger. Jim was in the early
He
60s.
wasn't World War II. Yeah, I need to get more people. I'd like to get as many as I can. We got 9,500 veterans in Sauter County. Know anybody that want to participate? I've asked some people and they don't want to, particularly ground.
Well, I think it's good. I mean, I think, John, it's a great idea, and I commend you for what you're doing, because most of us weren't interested in what our dads did in World War I until we were in our early 50s. I'm finding that same thing with my own children.
Yeah.
They're
Now
finally coming around.
Was your father in World War I?
One, yeah, and he was with Rickenbacker's squad.
Was he?
Yeah, over in France. And and he had a small camera that he carried all through World War I. I carried it through World War II. Of course, I couldn't get the film off the ship because of the security, but I did, some of it. But I didn't carry it into combat because it could fall in the hands of the Japs and there could have exposures on it that would benefit them. But
Do you have those photographs now?
my dad has an album that's just priceless.
Is that right?
Yeah.
World War I?
One.
Oh, boy.
And he had squadron insignias, which were canvas, because those are canvas-covered planes. I gave those over to the Air Force Museum some years ago, and but
Do you have mementos from the Second War, things that you brought back?
well, didn't have much to bring back. I've given what I had. I'm an honorary member of the Confederate Air Force. There's a squadron that has a TBF, TBM, and it was flown. It was in our squadron. It was taken off the Bunker Hill. And I run into this at an air show out in Denver in 1990, and went up to look at that plane, and I had 3 boys who had flown wing on me in that BC-81 with me. We got talking to them, and I said, do you have the history on this plane, and where did you get it? And he said, well, it came off of the Bunker Hill, and he said it was in Torpedo Squadron 8. I said, do you have the logbook on the plane? He said, we've got all of it. And I said, well, I was in Torpedo Squadron 8. Well, that started it, and they didn't have a plotting board. We didn't have any landmarks when you're flying out over the ocean, and you don't have any electronics to home in on. You take off, the ship's moving, you fly out 150 miles, you're going to go across, and you're going to come back, and where's the ship going to be? And you do all this on a what we call a plotting board with just a little dot, and it was amazing how we could do that. We could do that flying these anti-submarine hops, because we would fly out, take a cross leg, come back in, do the same thing. They would give us the relative heading of the fleet, because it never cruised straight like going due east or any other direction. They bracketed. And they did that so that the Jap subs that might follow them couldn't figure out where they were going.
Well, that's interesting. You think maybe there's, I'll call Jim Cricker, he was in the services there.
Right.
And he has a museum about his cousin.
There's another guy out of Lucasville that flew in the Marine Air Corps, was a fighter pilot. And he's got a used car lot out there. He used to have a little grocery store. I can't think of his name right now.
Well, Ebby, I want to thank you very much. Appreciate your being here.
Okay, John.
Appreciate everything you did. We were here over an hour.
Yeah. I've got some nice scrapbooks that I put things in, but there's not that much. There's no combat criteria that is.
Well, thanks very
Yeah,
much
we had
for
those,
coming in.
we had those gun cameras, but hell, the quality of
You never got any of
16
that.
millimeter in that time was not that good. But I spent a lot of time watching this History Channel.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They've got some just super
Boy, they
stuff.
sure do. Turn that off.